Hey everybody, we are Francis, Martin, and Robert, and this is Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Get ready, we're about to live in your head rent-free. Welcome back to Snakes and Otters.
I'm Martin.
And I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis in the captain's chair this time. We're going to finish out our 4-part series on Rome. We've spent the last 3 episodes of our history episodes on Rome. We've kind of chronologically built the different eras on it. We're wanting to tie it all together, to put a nice little bow on it this time here. We've talked a lot about the history and the personalities and the things that happened and many of the movements. This is going to be the episode that's kind of like, yeah, so why do we care? Why should Rome matter to us?
I mean, besides being history nerds.
That's exactly right. Yeah, because it is bigger than that.
It is.
It is much more
It
is much more than just the history itself. We owe so much to Rome.
So what you're saying is we're going to actually answer the question, what did the Romans ever do for us?
Oh, yes. And we're going to steal that right from Monty Python's Life of Brian. Actually, that whole scene that they do is spot on.
It really is.
Done tongue-in-cheek, but it's absolutely correct. They nail it so much. What did the Romans ever do for us? And everything that they pull out is absolutely true. And they are major game changers on all of that stuff. The aqueduct, broad peace, the whole everything in between. It really is that. Yeah. But we do have a moment, though. Speaking of Monty Python.
We have kind of a melancholy little chore we want to do. As we record this, we've received news that Python member, Python alum, and the director of Life of Brian, Terry Jones, has passed away at age 77.
Right, just a couple of days ago.
Absolutely, yeah. He of dementia. God save him. He hadn't done any public appearances since 2016 because he was unable to respond.
So sad.
It's so sad for such a brilliant mind. It's so much of what made Monty Python great belonged to Terry Jones. Now they all contributed, and they are all, that's one of the reasons that it is so great, because they had so many great minds with it. But he's the one that actually got them to the cinema. They weren't sure they could make this happen, and he's the one that sold the investors on, yes, we can do this, and let's do it. And he directed it. And he was also a historian, believe it or not.
Beyond all the Monty Python stuff, he really was a serious
several
historian.
Doctorates in medieval history in particular.
I didn't know about the doctorates. I know he had done several specials on whatever cable channel.
It was BBC's where they actually did the original recording, but they ended up on different ones here in the United States.
Right.
A&E did them, which I think, and it was the History Channel did some. He did one on the Crusades, on the Barbarians he did, which was a really excellent one. And Rome was one of his big subjects. He was, that whole period... he's in many respects kind of our muse for what we're doing here today, because he would have really gotten into this. I can think of Terry sitting in the chair right here as we're talking about this stuff, because he loved this sort of stuff. How Rome got carried forward into the medieval world, and from there into the modern world. That's what we're going to talk about today. So, but before we do that, we need to raise a glass.
Yes, to Mr. Creosote, to Brian's mother, to all the other, Sir Bedivere.
Oh, that's right, Sir Bedivere, that's right.
All the other great parts that Terry Jones played, and all the joy that he brought to especially the three of us.
Yes, and so many other people too.
Yeah.
Raise a glass of legacy bourbon to Mr. Jones.
Amen. Rest in peace, brother. You've done good.
Legacy. Larceny.
Sorry. Larceny.
Yes.
I was thinking of his legacy who we were toasting.
That's right.
And I messed it up myself. But larceny bourbon. It's good stuff. Yes. I wanted to do this, and Francis is pointing it out to me. He's off the twig. He's kicked the bucket. He's shuffled off this mortal coil, rung down the curtain, and joined the bleeding choir invisible. He's an ex-Terry Jones.
Yes,
very nice.
Amen.
That's the same tribute that John Cleese did when Graham Chapman died. So
right, which was from
very fitting.
Yeah, I mean, it was fantastic.
So before we move on to Rome, so Graham Chapman and Terry Jones, are any of the others passed?
No, the others. The others
I did not
are still
think
around.
so.
That's right. Yeah.
And Cleese actually has mentioned that 2 down, 4 to go. That's a quote from John Cleese. I know that sounds kind of cold, but I mean that's John
Cleese.
That's the way the 6 of them were.
That's right, they were, and they've stayed great friends all through afterwards, which is really a great testament to just how good they were. When you put them together, you got far more than the sum of them all. And that's one of the reasons we like Monty Python.
Okay.
And they like this sort of stuff. They like Rome. I mean, all the stuff, as I said in that sketch, is really, really true. And it's one of those why should we care type things. And I think I just kind of want to throw it out to you guys. As we've mentioned before, the Dark Ages, which we'll call that as the time after the light of Rome goes out, until later in the Middle Ages, the higher Middle Ages, when learning starts to come back through monasticism and other things like that. Initially, it's almost barbarism in many respects. And all the leaders that
In the West.
In the West, yes, we're talking in the West only. All of the leaders that rise during that time, and I'm speaking Charlemagne, Clovis, and a few others, are trying to recapture Rome.
So I would put them, not again, because I have a problem with the Dark Ages.
I know you hated that. I knew
It's just, but I would put someone like Charlemagne, I would not put him as part of the Dark Ages. Because that's the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire.
That is correct. That's where it can come out of that.
The learning of the monasticism, that's going on almost throughout this entire time as well. I think when the light of Rome goes out, it's one of those things you don't know how good you've got it until it's gone.
Yeah. Well, you've pointed this out before in that it's that lack of that central authority. Not that the whole world stops, but this lack of this central directing authority from the empire. But you're very right. Learning goes on. People are trying to rescue this legacy all through this period we call the Dark Ages.
Yeah. It's a lot harder. There's a lot more struggle going on. And Rome itself, the city, when we think of Rome, we think of the city, it suffers terribly.
Yes.
There's a point where the city, during its heyday, was 1 million plus people. It goes to a low of something like 10,000 people. And probably most of those guys work for the church. So, Rome as a city suffers horribly during the dark times. Yet, what is so important, does survive, which I think is such an amazing thing.
Yeah, there's so many threads that come forth from there that carry on even today. The Latin language itself. And I had 2 years of Latin in high school, so I get a little bit of this. So much of the English language, this is through that learning that came through, because English itself is totally unrelated to Latin.
Right.
It's
a Germanic language.
It's Germanic, it's barbaric in many ways is what they'd call it. And yet, the modern English language has stolen tons. And
we're so
tons.
good at that.
We are. And so much of the words that we have, the fact that feminine names end in A, that's Latin. That's the feminine for, filia means sister.
Right.
Anything that ends in an A, that's the way the Latin worked. US is male. That's a lot of that has made its way into our language today.
Yeah, language is really interesting because Latin, even though it's a dead language, it was the language of scholarship for 1,000 years and more beyond the fall of Rome in the West. And that is where so much of what Spanish and French is, and Portuguese, owes to Latin. So Latin influenced whatever the Franks were speaking, whatever the Spaniards were speaking.
All the Romance languages.
So, yes, all the Romance languages
owe
so much.
They are basically based
Italian.
in Latin. That's correct.
Yes.
Which was its own. It was the language of learning for 1,000 years after that. And it was also the only common language.
Yes.
That they would.
Oddly
could
enough,
use.
the lingua franca was not French. It was
I was
Latin.
almost going to say that, but you beat me to it. You're exactly right. That it was.
It was the language of commerce.
Exactly. In fact, and this is reaching back to Thomas More a little bit, he was fluent in Latin and English. In fact, all of his correspondence was usually in Latin.
Right. Because again, things that are official, things that are done, in his position, there would have been a lot of interaction with the church. All of that's going to be in Latin. Anything that is academic is going to be in Latin. There's also going to be some Greek. He probably knew Greek as well. I would imagine.
He did. But most, and see, everybody knew Latin. It was learned.
Yes.
There was a common agreement on that. That still works. We've adapted all that just because we don't use Latin too much on its own. It's all there.
Well, you're right. It becomes that way to translate information. So that then becomes the backbone of all the other things that are still out there that are worth grabbing. These threads of Rome that men like Charlemagne or Theodoric or even Justinian when he tries to retake the West, that they're grasping for. That's what makes it worth it. And that's the backbone of how they communicate those things. So what else besides the language? Again, you talked about Roman law at one point when we were show prepping.
This is huge. This is amazingly
huge. A lot of the
huge.
concepts of our law seep from Roman law.
It is, and yet it doesn't. The American system of law is based on a competing system, the English common law system.
It's a different philosophy.
Different philosophy.
Girding it.
And there's the difference. There is that the English common law that we subscribe to today is about precedent. Everything is about what you've done before, and that's what's used to say what you can and can't do. Roman law, and the Catholic Church still uses this in its canon law, is completely different. It is far more just, I believe, this is me speaking, because it takes the standard of what is good, what is correct, what is the best that we want to try to be. And every case that's brought before it is measured against that, trying to reach that standard. It doesn't matter what somebody else did or didn't do. We want to measure what you did versus this, and how close did you get, and what do we think what should be done about that.
In some ways, I think, especially Americans are going to listen to that and they're going to think, I don't even understand what that means. Because if you think about what that means, in a practical sense, if you and I commit the same act, but with slightly different circumstances, we could have different penalties laid on us for the same thing because of that. And you can still get that in current court. You know, like if I run my car into yours, and you're the only person in it, and you get a bump in your head, that's one thing. You run your car into somebody else's car, but there's a car full of kids in it and half of them die. That's a much different outcome. So there's still some of that, but that shooting for the ideal and measuring against that, that's a little bit hard to codify. So there's still going to be, I just want to get where there's still similarities real quick.
I can give you an example that illustrates this very clearly.
I was going to give the similarities, but go on.
Yeah, stay with me. I got this.
I know, but I was in the middle of a point.
I'm sorry. Under Roman law, you pull up at 5 a.m. to a stoplight that's red. You look around, you see nobody's there. You go on. The cop that's sitting next door to you recognizes you did what you should do and doesn't just pull you over. In the English common law, you come up, you do the same thing. The cop that's over there arrests you, gives you a ticket because you broke the law.
The only problem I have with that is that it sounds like you're saying the guy actually stops at the light and goes on before it turns. I've been to Rome. They don't even stop. So one of the ways that you can I like to talk about Roman law, about setting the ideal, and you're going to fall short, and that's okay because the whole thing is in the attempt. But the greatest example of Roman law at work really is the traffic laws in Rome. Because when we were over there a couple of years ago for that trip, which was phenomenal, everybody should go to Rome if they possibly can. You're driving down a broad lane, which is generally not in the heart of the city because, all those buildings are very close together because of the age of the city. But you're driving down either the express, not so much the expressway, but on the surface streets, and there are lines, just like there are in the U.S. And there's like 3 lanes that are painted. But there's 5 columns of cars at least. Because they don't pay any attention to that stuff. It's whatever you can get. And and the cops are doing the same thing, if they're even around. I think even the cops are afraid to drive in Rome. But, so it's very much that kind of a thing where, it doesn't really matter. What difference does it make?
There's a level of freedom that comes with that is not there otherwise. I think you can.
I think there's a higher level of responsibility as well.
That's exactly right.
Is it freedom or is it license?
No, I think
it's freedom because
it's freedom
the responsibility
because the responsibility that goes with it. It's exactly right. You are expected to make the best decision for yourself, and you are not, and you're allowed the freedom to make that decision. In this case, it's far less restrictive than our laws.
Now, to be sure, I always like to talk about how to explain the difference, using the Roman traffic laws, but also Roman law as a philosophical approach is thou shalt.
Yes.
Whereas English law, which is what the American system is based on, is thou shalt not.
That's exactly
as a general rule. But in Roman law, there's still a ton of, I mean, as far as the actual laws, there's still a ton of thou shalt nots.
Sure.
It's not to say that, everything is subjective, because it's not.
No, not at all.
But the idea behind that of being, here's the ideal. And so you see that play out in other places in Europe. Not so much here, obviously, but in Europe.
Because we took from a different system.
We took from a different
philosophy.
So, while we don't owe a direct debt to Rome for law, but Roman law is carried forward in the church.
Absolutely. Yes. It uses that same system.
Yeah, the church becomes, in addition to Latin, that also becomes that mechanism, that motor, the vehicle that brings Roman concepts forward.
Correct.
To touch on another one that we talked about a little bit in show prep is, again, the scholasticism, learning. Our whole concept of what you study to learn, our whole concept of how history is, that history is worth writing down, comes from Roman historians.
Absolutely.
Rome is really the first society that's really doing that, or making an attempt at real history. Anybody that reads Roman history will tell you it brings in gossip and has a political point of view. Everybody from Livy to Seneca to all of them all have something they're trying to prove, but it is really the first time anyone even attempts to write down real history.
Yeah.
And our ideas about history and learning come from Rome.
I mean, yeah, it's about the details. They want the details. They don't really care to forget them. Whereas other histories that you find in other cultures, it's only about making those in power look good sometimes.
Well,
there's a little of that.
It's about explaining things in myth. I mean, the Greeks have myth.
Yeah.
But that's not real history. The Romans have that as well.
Yes, they do.
But then they have attempts at genuine history.
So I think the two things that and maybe these can be related together, but one last thing on the law thing. The most essential thing is not so much the philosophy behind it, but the fact that from the very beginning of the Republic, remember we talked about that, they put on display the laws that were written to protect citizens. That is the most important thing that we pull forward from Roman law more than anything else.
That's right. And that comes from the Republic period.
And that comes from the Republic. That is so important. That lasts. And I think that may be tied to what makes them writing things down so important. Because it's not that necessarily others didn't think about what has gone before, but either accidentally or on purpose, they've realized that they have created something that needs to be remembered. And that
Interesting.
is, and again, this is supposition on my part to a degree, but I think there's something to that, because if you're going to preserve that rights of citizenship thing through the various parts, from not having it in the early kingdom to enshrining it in the Republic to at least giving it lip service and still having some rights in the empire, that's important. So I think that is kind of tied into the history. And that because they are so long-lived, Rome in the West is about a 1,200-year enterprise, give or take a little. So they've got a sense of history. And it's all centered in Rome, although not always, because the actual capital, it does... I forget where it was we talked about.
Ravenna.
Ravenna, thank you.
Yeah. The imperial court moves to Ravenna.
Right. And so, but Rome itself is still important because it's Rome. And these things are things, they do remember this. They do have their own sense of history. I think maybe, aside from the Egyptians, might be the first culture that has that same kind of sense of history beyond the importance of the current ruler and his own dynastic importance.
Right. That's unique to them.
Interesting. Very interesting. You're right. Usually history is used as a mechanism for propping up that current ruler.
Right.
Rome, I think it's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but it's synthesizing these two things. You're not just propping up the current emperor with that history. You're also maintaining that tie to the source of those laws.
Right. The system of government itself is what's important. At least in the Republic, it certainly was, and in the imperial period as well. Because
the structures from the Republic last into the
absolutely, yeah, it's
Empire. The Senate. While for us, most of us, we think of the Senate, we think of the House and the Senate makes up the Congress in the U.S. We don't necessarily put a whole lot of stock into those two bodies nowadays, but I think the Senate carried on a much bigger sense, a much bigger importance to Rome, and that was that vehicle for both the history and the law, the rights.
It allowed something unique in history for the first time. Citizenship and rights were defined. It is an enormous step forward. That hadn't really been done before. Nobody cared before. Nobody had the power to make it happen. It was whoever had the might had the right, and this was something different.
I think citizenship, the way we think of it, is inseparable from rights.
Absolutely. That's a Roman idea.
Because the Greeks would have had, you're an Athenian, because for them it's going to be more tied to the city-states. But for Rome, it was tied to a much larger entity, not just the city, but the lands that have become part of the empire or the republic.
They simply took it to its logical progression.
Right, because what is being a citizen without having some type of right and responsibility to go with it? It's meaningless.
That's right. And they were big on responsibility, too. I mean, compulsory military service and all that. The cursus honorum itself was nothing but that. You were expected to go into politics if you were one of those families. You're expected to do your time in all of these areas.
Right. Again, we're talking about the ideals, because obviously at various points during the history of Rome, a lot of this is corrupted.
Oh, yeah.
And there's corruption going on.
Yeah, anytime there's a dictatorship.
I don't want to make it sound like, this is some holy ideal that was so great and good.
Yeah, I mean...
But it is the ideal we're talking about.
By the time you get 100 years into the empire, yes, the consulships mean nothing. They're just political favors to be given out. But yes, that idea of noblesse oblige, that if you are capable of serving the state in some capacity, you do that.
That's right.
You do that. You're right. It's a very Roman idea that does carry forward to us. That's another one.
And it's not just the state, because it really is the people, too.
Yes.
Well, SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanum. I mean, it's the Senate and people of Rome.
Right.
It's both. And that's also unique.
Because we're still before the time where we think of a state.
Correct.
That is definitely post-Roman.
Right. Because once you become imperial, it's a different animal.
Well, even the Republic, we just would not have thought of things that way. I think it's only until we have competing attempts at recreating that empire, whether it be the Franks become France, the Holy Roman Empire, all of these things, where the entities that Rome has given birth to by its death, those are where we really get that idea of states, because they are now competing with each other to recapture that glory of Rome.
I'll give you an example from one of my favorite movies, Spartacus, with Kirk Douglas in 1960 and Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier plays Crassus in there.
We've mentioned Crassus.
That's right. And he talks with Tony Curtis, who's playing the slave Antoninus, and he says, Rome is an eternal thought in the mind of God. If Rome didn't exist, I'd dream of her. And he goes on for about a minute or two explaining why Rome is wonderful. And it's later on, Gracchus in the movie talks about it in a different way, speaking of that it's Rome is like a rich widow. Most Romans think of her as their mother. However, Crassus dreams of marrying the old girl, to put her politely, which is kind of about how things go off the rails. I mean, Kubrick did a really good job with that movie.
But I think it's interesting, again, the Rome being really kind of the first example of a political entity that has some obligation to its people, more than the people having an obligation to the political entity. But Rome has, at different periods in its history, even during the empire, has a grain dole, a social program.
Right.
Oh, yes, we talked about that in the show prep. That's unheard of before Rome, and yet that's very much what they do.
That's an idea that carries forward to
not
our
exactly
time today.
You did see that in Egypt. You look at what Joseph was doing.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Because in Egypt, with living on the entirely off the benefits of the Nile, you have to stock up for the future for the people. So that was a little bit out of necessity, but this is out of responsibility. That is a different thing.
That's exactly what I was trying to come up with and couldn't quite get there. That's exactly it. Yes.
Yeah. So an idea of the state has some responsibility
To its
people, not just a preparation to survive, as in Egypt on the Nile. It really is, okay, what are we going to do about this grain shortage? Or so an idea of that responsibility of some sort. Again, you could argue about, is that the kind of thing that a state should be doing? But the idea of a social program for the population carries forward to today. So,
if there's a certain level, we can argue about what the level might be,
right,
where the state has responsibility towards the survival and thriving.
The level
of its
is all
people.
you can argue.
That's right. Exactly.
And the how much of responsibility,
That's right.
or how much that responsibility should get played out at what particular level. The responsibility is always there.
That's right.
Because it is immoral to not. Because otherwise, the state owns the people.
Yeah. That's exactly
you're
right.
Nero playing the violin.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So law,
history,
history, social programs, a sense that the political entity has some obligation to its people.
And the people can claim things from it, too. They have some responsibilities and some
especially
benefits.
legal rights.
That's right. They have rights and benefits that come from that.
But what else? So I think some of the ones, we've got a nice long list here, and we probably won't even talk all of them. But one of the ones that strikes me near and dear is the art and architecture.
Oh, yeah.
When we look at the architecture in Rome and we look at the architecture in Washington, D.C., and in various state capitals around this country.
Absolutely. Well, county seats, too.
County seats. Yeah. We see a great deal of Rome. Now, some might say, the columns came from Greece. Maybe. Well, yes, they did. But where we see this stuff coming from is directly from Rome.
They perfected it.
We look at the Capitol in D.C. That has more Roman influence than it does Greek influence. The Rotunda, specifically, is especially modeled on the Roman Senate. Now, granted, nobody actually meets in that room anymore because we now have the two wings that were added lately. Most people don't even realize that. The two wings that we see in the Capitol are, Civil War era additions. Actually, the dome is more Civil War era additions, but the two wings are not long before that. So that rotunda was a central meeting place originally, just like the Senate would have been.
Right.
The very word rotunda comes from that.
Oh, yeah.
So,
we're going to talk about language and how many Roman words. We
yes.
couldn't possibly come up with all of them.
So,
they're everywhere.
Even the statues that you see in Rome, they are so much more sophisticated than what you saw in other places. They are much more lifelike than what you saw in Egypt. All right? You see musculature. It's not Michelangelo lifelike, but you see much more realism in the style of sculpture. And sculpture would have been far more important than the paintings, the frescoes, because early frescoes, that's where it starts, is in Rome. And, those were a lot more cartoonish, very flat, but still very sophisticated.
Often sexually oriented. Too.
Often sexually oriented. Mosaics, this is something that people still do today.
Sure.
They're still discovering
And they're still
mosaics
discovering, yes.
and going, wow, these are not what we expected. That's very much, that art as something accessible to a person owning a home. That's a Roman concept.
Well, public bathing is also a Roman concept, too.
That's kind of one I'm glad we don't carry forward a lot.
Yeah. Well, the fact that the idea...
Depends on the company.
Well, the idea of a swimming pool, that's a Roman idea. That's nobody... We wouldn't have thought to do that if it weren't for the fact that...
That's a very good point, because before Rome, nobody would have bothered putting together a bunch of good, clean water someplace for a bunch of dirty bodies to climb into.
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, the reason we have a swimming pool is because Rome believed in public hygiene. In many ways, I mean, the aqueduct was part of that.
Yeah, we don't use a swimming pool to bathe, but I mean, it's an outgrowth.
It's an outgrowth of
that.
it. That's right.
The bath, yeah.
Yeah. So what else do we have?
The calendar.
Oh, the calendar. Yes, that's almost as obvious as the roads.
Well, yeah, that's right. Exactly. And the alphabet and all that stuff. Although we don't use the Roman numeral system, and I
Thank God.
And I think we're all grateful for that.
Yes.
Thank you for the Arabic numerals for that. Makes a higher mathematics possible. But when it comes to the calendar, it's a big deal.
It is.
Granted, you've got two versions of it. You've got the Julian calendar that Caesar himself put together, and then the Gregorian adjustments that were put on it by Gregory the Great. But ultimately, the calendar that we all agree on today, which works, by the way,
is Roman.
Is Roman, and they were, and you think about that, they were able to accurately plot it where our years and our seasons always match
the way they're supposed to.
The way they're supposed to. That's right. They've successfully understood the way that Earth revolves, even though they probably could not have articulated that language. But they figured out the way things work. It has to work this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, calendar is a major thing when you think about it. Because other than by the weather changing, which can fool you.
Yes.
How are you going to know when to plant your crops? Other than by knowing there are 365 days a year, except this year when there are 366.
Right. Agriculture thrives, and therefore your people thrive because they're fed on a consistent basis. We cannot underestimate the value of having a proper calendar, and it also gives you a sense of history, because all that history you're talking about, that only makes sense in the presence of a calendar. So you can go backwards or forwards and accurately track things.
We no longer measure time by the number of years a monarch reigns.
That's right.
The calendar is truly universal now.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And he fits within that.
Yes. Because before, that's why we don't have a truly accurate date for the birth of Christ. Huh. The year we use now, we think is anywhere between 4 and 6 years wrong. Because we think the birth of Christ actually happened somewhere between 4 and 6 years BC. Before the birth of Christ.
Yeah. Because the calendar,
wait a minute.
the calendar was established before we knew how to figure that out.
Well, and because of
very accurately.
And not so much that as so much as nailing down exactly when that was based on the descriptions that we had in the Gospels was a little bit problematic because we didn't have that universal. We're in year 372. It was 371 last year. We don't have that consistent numbering. Because if we did, that would have been mentioned in the Gospels.
Exactly. Yeah, they would have used that.
Calendars are. It's probably one of the, if not the most important thing to get out of them, aside from, it's probably the most practical thing.
Yeah.
Because of the far-ranging effects. Without that, we wouldn't have, it used to be paper planners, but, now we've got apps on our phones.
Yeah, but they're all working off the same system.
They're all working off the same system.
They have to. And in a global economy, that's even more essential.
So the Roman legacy to the modern world is pretty substantial.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we haven't
it's
even
language, it's law, it's political entities, it's bureaucracy, the importance of communication, the bloody calendar, everything.
Mm-hmm. One thing that we didn't talk about, though, that I think is key, because this really kind of gives us to understand the Roman culture itself and why it was worth saving and bringing forward, is Rome, for all the bad press that it gets for its persecutions of the Christians and others, among that time, the Jews and others, really was based on assimilation and tolerance. That's one of the reasons it survived and thrived as long as it did, because it would expand itself. We talked about this a little bit. It would expand itself into other areas, and it would bring its culture with them, but it would also assimilate the good things from the local cultures and create a new normal from that. And sometimes those things would even flow back to Rome itself and change them.
So you're saying that Rome was multicultural?
Yeah.
That's a very loaded term.
I understand that, but you're exactly right.
But yes, it was multicultural in probably the best expression.
Exactly.
Because of what you just said.
Right.
The assimilation, it wasn't one culture overtaking another.
Nope.
It was the two merging.
and the best things from both come out the other side.
Yes.
Most of the time. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we can say that because looking back, that may or may not have been fully true. But that's the goal. Again, that's the ideal. You shoot for the ideal. You're not always going to hit it.
Right.
But that's the ideal.
It's that great melting pot with that stew in it we talked about before.
Because those ideas that were worthy, that had the traction, they were continued. They were just adapted.
And the persecutions that happened for the Jews and the Christians, they happened because they did not want to assimilate.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
That's why that was the biggest
they're rejecting
thing. Yeah, they're rejecting
being absorbed into the current.
Well, they didn't mind
system.
They didn't mind getting certainly the citizenship or the benefits, but they refused to give up certain things to get that.
Specifically, their religious beliefs.
which is a big deal. Rome usually was tolerant of that, but not always. And some of that also falls upon the shoulders of those currently in power. I mean, Caligula and Nero, come on. You're talking about serious loons here. And goodness knows Rome had its share of wild, terrible emperors. It's usually, when you have good government, that's not usually happening much. Now, there are exceptions. Vespasian's a good example of that, because he's the one that destroys Jerusalem under that. That's a longer story that we have.
That wasn't just about...
Correct. There's more. Lots to that.
That's a much bigger issue.
Yeah. One other structure that maybe we decry a great deal in our modern world that pulls forward from Rome, but it's pretty necessary, really, is the idea of a bureaucracy, of people to carry out what the government needs to be doing.
Administrative functions. I mean, that's maybe a kinder way of putting it. They believed in that. You can't run an empire their size successfully without some level of that.
Well, you can't do it beyond one generation.
That's right.
Which is why so many kingdoms rose and fell. Right. Because when you look at post-Rome in the West, there is no bureaucracy.
That's right. There's no system that survives.
Everything is personal power of the monarch or whoever the warlord, whatever term you want to use. And they're just saying, all right, I want you to go do this. I want you to go do this. Oh, I don't like what you're wearing. Off with your head. And you're going to send somebody else to do it.
Well, that's why feudalism sucks so bad, because it was vulnerable to all that. And it's the ultimate decentralization, but it terribly... It was every time there's a change like that, the common people fear for their lives, because then it's anarchy. Potentially,
actually, I would say it's the ultimate centralization, because all the power is centralized in one place, the monarch.
Yes, but it's decentralized to the nobles, and from there to the serfs and all that. So it's kind of got that level of it's meant to be a bureaucracy, but there's no administrative function. It's usually almost ownership. It's almost slavery.
Well, yeah, feudalism is basically. And you're right, wherever there was a ruler attempting to be effective, or where there wasn't an effective ruler, there's bureaucracy.
That's right.
There's people carrying out the work that needs to be done for that government to thrive. And where that's absent, you're right. Absolutely right, Robert. It's personal power.
Sure. It goes back to that point.
Yeah.
And when that point breaks, it falls apart.
Yeah, exactly. When that power is gone, then there's no one carrying out the work of government, whatever that work is, whether it's tax collection or justice or whatever.
Right. The very word of government is it's not a modern invention, because obviously there was government in Rome, there was government in Greece, there's government but government, the way we think of it today, took a long hiatus during what we would call either the Dark or the Middle Ages, however you want to put it. Because all of that power, or all of those functions were not organized.
Right.
And it's when the world starts to emerge from that darkness is when you start to see these political entities reinstitute some form of bureaucracy.
Which is based in law.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's because Rome has law that's, the bureaucracy stems from the law. When law itself is irrelevant, it's only personal power, then it's completely changeable.
Yeah, the law charges the government with responsibilities.
Right. It's what lasts between generations.
Yeah, something has to carry that forward. So when you start to see successful, for example, English monarchies.
That's right.
What are they doing? Well, they have a bureaucracy. They have justices of the peace,
That's right.
what we would call them today, out in the world.
Constabularies.
Constabularies, and they are doing the work of the king.
That's right, in his name.
Yeah.
And a lot of that started with the Magna Carta and moved forward.
King
By the
John
time
and-
Exactly. By the time Henry VIII is in place, it's in full form.
Oh, yeah, it was a very big deal. We talked about this with
Tom Moore,
Richard III and
Absolutely.
the Tudors. Why the Tudors succeed? Well, not just because they made Richard look bad, but they were putting those administrative structures
That's right.
that were part of the Wars of the Roses back to full flourish. Richard
Right.
was trying that. His brother Edward was trying that before him, and the Tudors took off with it.
Right.
And that stabilized the English monarchy and made eventually England the premier kingdom of
The world.
the world.
Which was always looking to model itself on the Roman Empire. They saw that as successful. That's another one of the legacies is all those who succeed at supreme executive power, to steal from Monty Python again, they look back to Rome for their ideas. They recognize they succeeded at it.
Anytime, from what we have seen so far in history, that a people try to govern themselves or at least have some kind of power that they have, we look back to Rome. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the United States, whether it's the French republics, or even Napoleon, who,
Ironically, yeah.
yes, ironically, because he took Roman terms. He was the consul.
Right.
And again, he wanted to recreate that Holy Roman Empire.
Because he saw it had value. He saw it worked.
Well,
and
it's a way to, if you can institutionalize your authority is a lot safer. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the real secret of the longevity of Rome. They managed to institutionalize what it meant to be a Roman.
Well, the entire concept of the institution was them. That was their idea.
They institutionalized power.
Yeah.
They institutionalized power, and again, that's so striking when you see that carried forward. That, all right, the power of the Tudor dynasty moves from Henry VII to Henry VIII to Edward to Mary to Elizabeth and on, not from just their personal magnetism, but because
That's right.
they've institutionalized the power of the state in such a way that recognizes the government has work to do.
That's right. Succession becomes a de facto non-issue in many ways. They still cry for it. They still look for it. But ultimately,
Which is ironic considering the succession issues that the empire
that's
had.
that's why I brought it up, because
Yeah.
they didn't. But yet they still survived and thrived even through some of the worst of all emperors.
The that institutionalizing, what that does, what makes them different, and I don't know how much aware of this they would have been or those that later, but looking back, I think what makes everything different is that rather than the leader of your society, whether it be a kingdom or whatever, whether you are a pharaoh in Egypt or you are Cyrus in Persia, doesn't matter. Those essentially have the same power and authority as an emperor or as a king.
Yeah.
The names are different, but what the Romans did was they turned that leadership position into an office through dictators.
Yes, that's exactly it.
That is what makes it different, I think, and maybe that's part of that genius that they stumbled onto. Maybe all of this is one big accident, but institutionalizing the leadership into an office is a huge deal.
That's right.
I think you're right. I think that part might be an accident, but when you combine that with the recognition that the government has an obligation to do certain jobs, that I think they did know.
Yes.
Right.
When you combine those two things, then you get a very Roman and hopefully 21st century concept of good government
Yeah.
Right.
and Rome's legacy.
When you look at when Rome fell, when the church stepped in the city, in the places where it was strong, which is granted most of society at the time, it is definitely going to take on some of those structures. Okay. It takes on some of those. Martin was just giving us the time call there, so I can't believe we've already talked 40 minutes. That's really good. But by those structures existing, it was easier for the church to step in and be that caretaker of civilization until the rest of what was Rome could get reorganized. Because whether you see it in the monasteries spread throughout of the Franks and the Germanys and wherever else, the structures by being there helped ensure that the dark times didn't last as long.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there definitely were dark times. I just don't think they lasted as long as most people think.
Right.
And I think that's partly because of this.
That's right. The church continued on in a system that was proven to work.
Yes, they basically took on a lot of the structures. Now, they were already doing that because it's a good model.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you pointed out.
They knew.
And,
yes. But it worked.
But it worked. Yeah. And, as you pointed out, the very word that we use to divide up the church, diocese, comes from Rome.
It's a Roman administrative division.
Right.
Yeah. So, basically, I think I mentioned this in the show prep, too, as our view of the world is largely through a Roman prism, especially when we talk about the obligations government has, how governments can be structured.
Or should be.
Yeah,
should
and
be,
just what a functioning society looks like is all colored by our perception of Rome.
You have it surrounded, sir. That's exactly right.
It is. And I'll even go a step further. How we look at the rest of the world is filtered through that image, because look at how we view the Middle East. Even though our current troubles in the Middle East are with a group of people whose religion and system of organization didn't exist until 200-ish
Give or
years,
take.
Almost 200 years
200 years
after the fall of Rome in the West.
Yeah. Around 700 or so.
Yeah, mid-sixes.
Yeah.
So that is a major thing, because just like the Persians dealing with the Greeks, Alexander, and then the Persians dealing with the Romans. Now we have the troubles we have in the Middle East. There seems to very much be a what we call the East and us being the West. This is still very much, maybe it's geographic, I don't know, but we still have that same kind of prism.
It's a Roman
Competing systems.
division.
Right, but it's different systems now.
Yeah.
But we still look at it in that East versus West kind of a way, even if they didn't use those same terms.
But Rome saw Persia as that competitor,
Yes.
that other empire.
Which grew philosophically from very different roots. So
Yes.
thinks very differently.
Yeah.
So it's more than just geography or culture or ethnicity. It's a philosophical opposition of each other when it comes to ways of government and things like that.
Yeah, but I think that would probably going to be true of any other, because if you look at the conflicts with Carthage, with Egypt, until they managed to conquer those,
Sure.
you still have a different philosophical, and probably for most conflicts,
But
the philosophical differences are going to be,
Yeah.
and how things are organized, your system, there's going to be differences there. Look at the U.S. versus Soviet Russia or Communist Chinese. There are major philosophical differences. I think if the philosophical differences are not there, then there's very much a smaller chance of war and conflict. Hitler had a different philosophical basis for how he ran Germany. That was going to bring him into conflict with everybody else.
yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
When you look at Europe today, it has basically the same philosophical underpinnings. That's why Europe has been at peace
You all right there, Francis? He's all right.
for 60 years. And it would be nearly unthinkable for a war in Europe.
Yeah.
It's unless it came from the East.
Yeah. Again, we just to wrap up a little bit, but we look at all those administrative structures and how a society should be structured in our political entities through that Roman prism.
Whether we realize it or not.
Yep. So, Francis, next week, next episode, what do we got?
We're going back to our Code of Honor episode, but we're going to do it a little differently this time. We're going to start and stay with one phrase.
Excellent.
That you're going to captain that.
I'm going to captain that, and you have to tune in next week to find out what that,
because it's a biggie,
that very special Code of Honor is going to be all about. Thanks for being with us here every week at Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Be sure to spread the word on your social media accounts. Follow us and retweet us. We are on Instagram and on Twitter at Snakes and Otters.
Let your friends know that they can find us on Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Just search Snakes and Otters Podcast to find us, and please remember to leave us your comments and reviews. It helps people find us.
And you can always send us an email at snakesandotterspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. Catch us next week. Same snake time, same otter channel.